A very warm welcome to you all on behalf of Global Canopy for the launch of the Deforestation Action Tracker of 2023. My name's David Shukman. For many years, I was a BBC correspondent covering, among other things, deforestation. So it's a subject that's very close to my heart, and delighted to support Global Canopy and all the work they're doing on this. So you're welcome to this session. We're going to be hearing the latest findings of this assessment of 700 plus financial institutions in terms of their risks to deforestation, and we're going to be hearing the details of that. It's also a time of tightening regulation in many quarters on deforestation to counter it. So we'll have an update on that. And I get a sense of what it might mean for you in your sector. And we're now well over 100. So welcome to everybody who's joining even now. And then, of course, we don't want this session to be overly depressing. We all need little rays of sunshine, and we're going to try and hear about what the pockets of progress are, what they look like, what does best practice look like. So that'll be a note to end on. And all the way through, we're very keen to emphasize, we really want your questions, and we hope to have time to answer them as fully as we can. We've got a great panel who I'll introduce in just a moment. So as I say, I was a correspondent for many years for the BBC and saw the effects of deforestation for myself repeatedly. And so part of this for me, the interest for me is that I've been repeatedly shocked by what it looks like, what it means, what the implications are. Seeing rich, noisy, dark, biodiverse forest converted into monoculture, which is largely silent, is a really tragic sight. And by the same token, as a reporter going to cover deforestation, I've been on the receiving end, you might say, of corporate spin by the bucket load. Major producers, buyers, traders, everybody involved in the supply chain, from cultivating, growing commodities, raising cattle, through to the people using the stuff at the other end, making promises about doing everything they possibly can to limit deforestation, and by and large, that not really happening. So the road to halting deforestation is littered, in my view, with broken promises, which is why it's so important that we're seeing an age now of greater transparency, greater scrutiny, and greater, I'm glad to say, greater involvement and engagement with this topic. The other point I'd just like to make before we get stuck into the meat of this session is that I find in my post-BBC life, engaging with many different organizations, including large companies, that you very often get a CEO who announces with great pride a net zero target, and sometimes that pride is justified if they've got near-term milestones, 2025, 2027, and that kind of thing, and you think they're serious, rather than just hoping to get to 2049 and plant a few trees and hope that they've met net zero by 2050, which of course they won't do. But by the same token, many of these companies that have these net zero targets, when you ask about deforestation, you get a curious waffle or shuffling of the feet. And certainly the entourage around the CEO might be shuffling their papers and studying their shoes. And you realize that quite often they don't get it, that deforestation is an integral part of net zero. I mean, I was talking to one CEO the other day who said, look, we've got the net zero thing, but the deforestation, it's all a bit complicated. I said, look, it's the other side of the same coin. You can't do net zero. You can forget the Paris Agreement at 1.5 and 2 if you don't stop chopping the trees down and making sure that whatever you do, you're not aiding that process and that you're halting the process of deforestation. And just a final point for me before we move on anyone who's studied the work of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, their last report made very clear a long list of measures to deliver net zero. And number one was solar, because it's so cheap and easy to deploy. But number two of 30 or 40 different measures was halting deforestation. So it's right up there, deservedly, and that's based on analysis of the peer-reviewed research, right up there as a really key component of any net zero strategy. And I think it's absolutely vital that any educational process, awareness raising, training at the corporate level makes that very, very clear, the absolutely pivotal importance of deforestation. So look, enough from me. Let me introduce our panel. In no particular order, we've got Alex Reid, who is Senior Global Policy Advisor at Global Witness, Puninda Thind, who's Finance Nature Lead with the UN Climate Champions, and well, last but not least, because we're going to hear from her first, Emma Thomson, who's with Global Canopy and has been involved in putting together the Deforestation Action Tracker, which is an immense amount of work. So it's Emma and a team who've really toiled over the numbers to come up with the results. So I think what we're going to do first is, Emma, I'm going to throw to you, and you're going to take us through the main findings, the main conclusions, and then that'll provide meat for our discussion as we go. So Emma, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. Before digging into the key findings, I do want to take a moment to quickly recap on what the Deforestation Action Tracker is and why Global Canopy have decided to assess over 700 financial institutions on their deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuse policies. Financial institutions have a critical role to play in driving action on these issues through the clients or holdings that they finance. This has been increasingly recognized internationally, but also by the financial institutions themselves. The momentum and pressure for progress on the finance sector for action on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses has been building. 2021 saw the Glasgow Declaration on Forests and Land Use signed at COP26, and GFANZ and Race to Zero also rose to prominence. 2022 saw the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero release a report of expectations for entities with net zero commitments, including for financial institutions to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation from their portfolios by 2025. The Global Biodiversity Framework was also agreed. And in 2022, Global Canopy launched our baseline review of the 500 financial institutions at the time that were members of GFANZ and Race to Zero on their performance on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses, which showed that there was a long way to go. Today, in 2023, we have launched our detailed assessments of the financial institutions in GFANZ and Race to Zero, which comes at a crucial time for these global climate targets, with just 2 years to go until 2025, and as you mentioned, David, just a few days in advance of COP28. I do want to briefly recap on how these assessments were completed. All 700 plus financial institutions were assessed between the 22nd of May and the 31st of August on any information that was publicly available on their websites. All institutions were assessed in English and the official language of the country where they're headquartered. And this year, we also shared those assessments with all financial institutions for optional comment prior to the publication today. Each financial institution has been given a total score out of 100, which is made up of the 4 following components of our assessment: their overall approach, so their performance on these issues at the board level; policy strength, so their policies on deforestation and traceability that apply to their clients or holdings; associated human rights abuses, including policies on free, prior, and informed consent and customary rights to land, resources, and territory. And finally, making up half of their score is implementation and reporting, so an assessment of how they're implementing the policies that they have and how they're transparently reporting on them. So what did we find? The key takeaway from this report is that of the 700 financial institutions with high-profile net zero commitments that we assessed, 75%, so 3/4, had no publicly available deforestation policies for any of the commodities with the highest deforestation risk. That includes cattle products, so beef and leather, soy, palm oil, and timber products, including paper. This does show a small improvement on the results of our baseline review last year, but it is clear that there is still a really long way to go for the vast majority of financial institutions. And now digging into the detail a bit more, as you can see on the slide, is that while 75% in purple have no deforestation policy publicly available at all, just 10% of those assessed, which equates to 69 financial institutions, which is shown there in black, have a policy available for all 4 highest risk commodities. We also looked at whether these financial institutions with policies had a target date for those commitments. What we could see is that actually 75% of those with the deforestation policy did have a target date, the majority of which were actually to 2025, which shows an alignment with the UN high-level expert group's expectations. But for the majority, as we can see with the purple, there is still a really long way to go. As part of the Deforestation Action Tracker assessments, we also looked at the amount of financing that each financial institution was providing to companies with a known high risk of deforestation. What we found is that financial institutions headquartered in the US alone represent 58% of that total finance, which is equivalent to 3.1 trillion US dollars. So financial institutions in the US in GFANZ and Race to Zero have a really significant amount of leverage that they can use. This table shows how much in financing the 5 US financial institutions with no deforestation policies are providing to companies with a known high risk of deforestation. There's a lot of data on this slide, but as you can see, BlackRock and Vanguard each represent over 10% of the finance to the high-risk companies of this group of 700 institutions that we assess, and neither have a publicly available deforestation policy for any of those high-risk commodities. Both the GFANZ and Race to Zero coalitions are made up of member initiatives, and we were able to narrow our analysis down to the different initiatives that make up GFANZ to understand their performance on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. As you can see on the left of the screen, 80% of the Paris-aligned Asset Owners Initiative do not have a publicly available deforestation policy for any of the high-risk commodities, which equates to 45 organizations, and 64% of them didn't have any publicly available human rights policies. Moving to the center of the screen, we found that none of the financial institutions in the Net Zero Insurance Alliance had a publicly available deforestation policy for all 4 high-risk commodities, and just 25% had at least one policy in place. But there is a more positive story here. As you can see on the right-hand side, 42% of the Net Zero Banking Alliance members have published at least one commodity-specific deforestation policy, and 55% did have at least one publicly available human rights policy as well. So far, we've spoken about the policies that the financial institutions have published, but as we near the 2025 target date set by the UN high-level expert group and the 2030 targets of the Glasgow Declaration, what is clearer than ever is that policies are meaningless without effective implementation. We know that the EUDR, commonly referred to as the European Deforestation Due Diligence legislation, has already committed to review whether it should be extended to require financial institutions to also act on commodity-driven deforestation. And it's clear that the compliance risk on financial institutions is the compliance risk is growing. One of the key ways financial institutions can drive change is through the leverage that their finance provides. This can be through working with clients or holdings to improve their practices and drive change on the ground, with the risk that finance could be removed if that change does not happen quickly enough. But when we look at the performance of the financial institutions that we've assessed, we see that far too few are using that leverage effectively. As you can see, 46% of those with at least one deforestation policy are monitoring and engaging clients or holdings, meaning they have an approach in place to identify clients or holdings that are non-compliant and are also engaging with them to drive that change. But also only 14% are transparently reporting on their progress for at least one commodity. Transparency is absolutely vital for tackling deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. And what we're seeing is that even of those with policies, the majority aren't stepping up on that transparency. As David said, there are pockets of progress that we do need to talk about. There is optimism and hope here. So as you can see, 6% of those that were assessed both in 2022 in our baseline review and this year have published at least one new deforestation policy for at least one of those high-risk commodities. 44% of the financial institutions we've assessed are involved in some kind of collaborative finance sector initiative focused on deforestation or legislative advocacy related to deforestation. So there is a really promising picture of progress and collaboration, but we need to see that collaboration transfer into concrete action. And then finally, I want to talk about the Finance Sector Deforestation Action Initiative, which we found that 71% of the initiative have published at least one deforestation policy, and 56% have published one for all 4 commodities we assessed, showing an improvement on last year. Before I finish, I do want to quickly run through the recommendations that we have based on the assessments we've done of these 700 financial institutions. Firstly, Global Canopy calls on GFANZ and the other net zero coalitions assessed to require both transition planning and progress reporting on action on deforestation, conversion, and human rights, and to include deforestation in their relevant guidance tools and data offerings. And then for the financial institutions themselves, to join ambitious alliances, like the FSDA with a strong commitment to address commodity-driven deforestation by 2025, and the IPDD, the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, which takes an active position on policy around deforestation. Thirdly, to set strong policies as a critical first step to acting on deforestation. Effective policies are crucial to align their internal processes to strong commitments and send a clear signal to portfolio clients and holdings on expectations for compliance and thresholds for engagement. Fourth, to actively engage portfolio companies with clear and time-bound expectations on addressing and eliminating deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. And finally, report transparently about their actions and their progress. When financial institutions are taking action, they should share this publicly and report at least annually on that progress. Thank you very much.
Well, that's very clear. Thank you very, very much indeed. Clear and depressing. And to say with little pockets of hope as well. Let's move straight on to Alex Reid from Global Witness. Alex, do you want to pick up on that and share your perspective on the whole issue of regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. Emma, if you don't mind pulling up my slide, that would be really helpful. So thank you so much, Emma, for that whistle-stop tour of what is a very demanding assessment of over 700 financial institutions. It's really a public good that Global Canopy is doing this work, because GFANZ isn't doing it itself, nor is Race to Zero. And nature is clearly climbing up boardroom agendas, and it's really essential to consider the fact that GFANZ leaders last year published a statement saying that deforestation is a clear pillar of their expectations for all of the members, and also that deforestation has been integrated into all of the GFANZ transition planning guidance that they've issued so far. So we know that it's climbing up agendas. What's really obvious from this year's results, however, is that it isn't leading to action with the prioritization that is required. I mean, having a policy is the very bare minimum that we should expect at this point, considering that the target date that Emma really helpfully referenced there is 2025 for ending commodity-driven deforestation. That's what the SBTI is using in their forestry, land and agriculture guidance. That's what the UN Secretary General made clear last year at COP. And he was very explicit that that applies to finance too. And voluntary initiatives that don't set that 2025 deadline shouldn't get to call themselves net zero anymore. So we were joking last year that GFANZ might be about to drop 2 letters, and I'm definitely still waiting for them to publish that 2025 date for their guidance. It's really against that backdrop that we see the net tightening on nature and finance more broadly, but also specifically in 3 key jurisdictions, so the EU, the UK, and the US. They are in some ways more progressive and kind of striving to create a playing field that establishes the necessary regulations for everyone to be as ambitious as their FSDA group has been. And we're seeing some of the dividends of that already. So both the UK and the EU have passed laws to prohibit the import of goods, forest risk commodities grown on deforested land. In the UK, that only applies to illegally deforested land. In the EU, that applies to all deforestation, whether it was legal or illegal. And those are already, in practice, impacting investor appetite when it comes to deforestation risk. We've seen investors publicly speaking out and saying that we expect the companies in our portfolio to comply with that, particularly because a well-enforced law will see significant penalties. So in the EU's case, for example, it can be up to 4% of EU turnover that year. So that's clearly very dissuasive. And as a result of those trade laws, really, we're seeing for the first time financial regulators stepping in. And in the EU and UK, there are ongoing assessments of their regulatory frameworks to work out why the existing laws that we have are not preventing finance from flowing for companies that we know are carrying out deforestation based on investigations by groups like Global Witness and others out there, and to make sure that financial institutions are treating agriculture in particular, and then also other industries such as mining, as the high-risk sectors that they really are for illegal activity, but also just more broadly for deforestation as well, because without eliminating that from your portfolio, you can't reach your own net zero target either. I wanted to give a quick word to the US as well, based on the exposure there that Emma addressed in the figures. So it's very clear that the US is in a kind of unique situation, and it's very surprising still in 2023 that we see BlackRock and Vanguard without a deforestation policy guiding what they choose to invest in. We're about to see in the US the reintroduction of the US Forests Act, which would make global deforestation a predicate offence for money laundering, which means that it could be targeted by US financial crimes enforcement. And that's quite an exciting opportunity and a real sort of game changer in the US. And there's a significant amount of bipartisan support behind that, in addition to Biden having issued his executive order on how there can be a whole of government approach to tackling global deforestation. So it's come at a really positive time as well, I think, for financial institutions, these legal developments, because whilst there's already so much data available, you're also seeing other vital pieces of the puzzle coming online as well, whether that be TNFD or Forest IQ, which has been launched by Global Canopy, or just broader mandatory disclosure along sustainability lines, which is bringing a lot more data online as well. So we certainly hope to see more financial institutions speaking out in favour of mandatory due diligence, so that we can really level with it.
Alex, many thanks. That's very clear, and I loved your description of the net tightening. And I think on many fronts, that's what we're seeing. Let's move straight on to Puninda. Puninda, take us through your area of expertise, which is kind of really internationally on a broader scale, and including COP28 starting on Thursday. What kind of moves we could expect to see?
Yes, thanks, David. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you all here today. And thanks very much to the Global Canopy team for this very comprehensive analysis coming at a very pivotal time, as you said, right before COP28. As everyone on the call knows, we know that financial institutions' net zero targets cannot be met without ending deforestation. So I'll briefly speak to some of these pockets of progress that we're seeing across the ecosystem, building on what Alex and Emma have shared, especially regarding the regulatory momentum and the momentum from the private sector that we are seeing, and need to, as mentioned, further accelerate the policies to action. So the Finance Sector Deforestation Action Initiative, as was mentioned, is a leading group of financial institutions that are advancing the commitment that they made at COP26 to use best efforts to eliminate agricultural commodity-driven deforestation from their portfolios, focused on a core set of commodities, including palm oil, soy, beef, pulp and paper, and increase investments in nature-based solutions by 2025 in terms of contributing to the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forest and Land Use. And so this past year has seen the Finance Sector Deforestation Action members, which is a group of over 35 financial institutions that represent approximately 8 trillion in assets under management, to continue making progress towards the milestones that are outlined in this commitment, which are very much aligned with the finance sector roadmap. And this includes creation and adoption of deforestation policies, but also action around assessment of deforestation risk across their portfolios, starting or deepening active company engagements on this topic. And they're also beginning to disclose risk and mitigation activities in a transparent way as of this year. Other actions taken by the Finance Sector Deforestation Action members include engaging with major data providers to call for issuer-level data on deforestation risk exposure and management. And the Forest IQ resource that was launched by Global Canopy is definitely a strong signal of progress in that front. There's no longer an excuse for financial institutions to say, we don't have the data to start this journey. Those tools are really coming out in full force. And this year, we're also seeing mainstreaming of deforestation across the finance networks. So this year, the expectation on deforestation action has been mainstreamed across the sector as specified in the Investor Agenda's Investor Expectations Ladder, which is endorsed by groups like AIGCC, CDP, Ceres, IGCC, so I'm naming a lot of acronyms, PRI, UNEP-FI. So all these investor agenda partners that have come together to include deforestation as part of the guidance for financial institutions to develop net zero transition plans and set portfolio targets aligned with the global goal of tackling deforestation and land conversion by 2030. Including and signposting to existing resources like the finance sector roadmap. So we're seeing this broader alignment across the ecosystem, which is very helpful. And then lastly, looking forward to COP28, which is coming up at the end of this week, we do hope to see momentum on strengthening this nature-climate nexus. So many different organizations across the ecosystem, including Global Commons Alliance, Global Canopy, TNFD, Business for Nature, World Economic Forum, and others have gotten behind this Nature Positive for Climate Action call to action, which really outlines some key no-regret actions that businesses and financial institutions can start taking, which includes addressing deforestation, joining the Finance Sector Deforestation Action Initiative, and really embedding nature in climate transition plans. And this year, we've seen, in methodologies and targets and frameworks like Science-Based Targets for Nature, TNFD framework, investor stewardship and policy engagement initiatives like Nature Action 100, PRI's Spring Initiative, IPDD. So there are really those tools and resources available for financial institutions to kickstart this journey. And so we hope that the momentum at COP28 can further galvanize that strengthening of the climate-nature nexus and mainstreaming of deforestation action across the real economy. The other aspect that I'll just note briefly is that the food systems transformation agenda will also be high up on the radar at COP28. And so non-state actors from farmers to businesses, cities, civil society, and consumers, and all those who are engaged in food systems have developed a non-state actor call to action for transforming food systems. And this call to action really mobilizes or aims to mobilize all these different actors to address all the key different levers that we need to move to allow for food system transformation, a key element of which we know includes deforestation and land conversion. So we hope that some of these activities can show up front and center at COP and really move the needle in the right direction to mobilize action.
Puninda, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. I was just thinking, you mentioned the acronyms. Of course, if acronyms could themselves halt deforestation, we'd all be in a very, very healthy state, because it is a field that's littered with them. But there's a lot of very interesting stuff going on there, and clearly momentum, as you described. As I said at the beginning, we're very, very keen to hear questions from everybody. I see we've got 120 plus people on the call now, which is fantastic. So one question that's just come up, which I think we will follow up on. I mean, and this is really for Emma, I guess. I mean, as you've and your colleagues have done the assessment about financial institutions that do or mostly don't have deforestation policies, what does good look like? So the question specifically is, what is recommended in terms of a strong no deforestation policy for a financial institution? Is there guidance around that? So Emma, perhaps you could talk us through what, I think this would be very, very helpful for people to hear, what they should be striving for, and specifically, how do they set about doing it?
Absolutely. There is a lot of guidance that is available for financial institutions that do want to address either their assessment and what we found, or that want to start acting on this for the first time. Global Canopy has published the Finance Sector Roadmap, which goes into a lot of detail on exactly what a strong deforestation policy looks like, as well as what tools and other guidance is there to support the setting and implementation of that policy. But to give kind of a high-level picture of what a good, strong deforestation policy looks like, firstly, it would be to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation and conversion of natural ecosystems from their financial portfolios, ideally by 2025 or as soon as possible thereafter, with a really ambitious target date, but also to address the human rights abuses that are often associated with that deforestation and conversion as part of that commitment. Deforestation and conversion will not be eliminated unless those human rights abuses are also addressed. So those three do come together really cohesively and as a trio, really. And as well, a strong deforestation policy should also set out clear expectations of finance clients or holdings. What do they need to do? When do they need to achieve it? What will happen if they don't achieve it by a certain point? What will that engagement process look like? And how will the financial institution determine that? And again, the Finance Sector Roadmap really does go into a lot more detail on that. I believe it's in phase 2. So I would really recommend financial institutions to look there.
And just to follow that up, I see all kinds of links are being put in the webinar chat. The road map you described, presumably someone can post that there. Yes, there it is, even as we speak. Someone has posted that, so that's fantastic. So if anyone who needs that, that's available. That's a very clear way to proceed. This is really another one for you, Emma, but perhaps just briefly, how do you calculate a financial institution's known exposure to deforestation risk? But I want to share out the questions amongst the rest of the panel. So perhaps just give us a briefish answer on that.
Yes, absolutely. So we do go into much more detail on this in our methodology document that's available on the Deforestation Action Tracker webpage. But essentially, we've looked at any shareholdings, loans and underwritings, and bond holdings that were active as of October 2022 into the companies that have been identified as being high risk by the Forest 500, another Global Canopy project, and also by Forests and Finance. So determining the amount of finance each financial institution is providing to at least one of those companies.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I mean, all of this prompts me to ask the question about what in the simplest terms is the sequence of things that needs to happen to prevent the likes of Global Witness. I'm thinking, Alex, yet again coming up with a report with household names, supermarket chains, and so forth, yet again effectively caught buying products that have almost certainly fueled deforestation. What out of this tightening, as we've heard, of the sort of regulatory net, all of the diplomatic activity and the corporate level, and this greater scrutiny and transparency with the likes of the tracker, how do you then get to an ideal solution where deforestation actually does stop?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I would say we don't like naming and shaming. We'd much rather be pulling out positive examples and doing the role that Puninda did here today. But these examples, the scale, the billions that we're able to show every single year flowing into businesses that we know are operating in high-risk sectors, to us, it feels like a very proportionate response to then be able to do your own due diligence. If organizations like Global Witness can find instances of deforesting companies in your portfolio, then so can you. So I think the first thing is to kind of ditch the excuses, perhaps, that some FIs have relied upon in the past. There isn't the data. We don't really understand nature. Is nature very important to climate? Our board doesn't prioritize this. We don't think that there's any excuses anymore. You know, the guidance is extremely clear. There are so many resources now out there to help financial institutions, and people need to, you know, get involved and start thinking about how they apply this. It's not easy, but some financial institutions are showing really practically the way forward. I think the second thing is to use the data that already exists. So rather than thinking and waiting for TNFD to come down the line with hundreds of metrics, what we really need is for people to use the types of data that Global Canopy collects or that Global Witness is collecting, so that you can engage with companies in your portfolio, or so that when you have your risk-based approach, which is decided through your policy that says, we want to meet this 2025 date, you say, no, I don't think this company has anything less than a negligible risk of engaging in deforestation. We often hear there's not sufficient data, but what is really helpful is, as the financial institution, you're in a very privileged position to ask your client to what extent their supply chains have been assessed for deforestation risk. How do they prevent human rights abuses? So whereas Emma is trawling through 700, you know, web pages of these financial institutions to find public documents, you can ask for more as part of those deals. I think the third thing is to use your political power as a financial institution. So we worked really hard in the UK to get that finance review in the Financial Services and Markets Act that's got the Treasury, you know, really involved in this agenda. We had financial institutions worth 2.7 trillion who were backing the call for a new due diligence law. They're right at the front, and they're going to be in a very advantageous position when and if these regulations come in. So I think the time for action is definitely now, and we won't be letting the 2025 deadline just slip us by.
Okay. So let's move on to a question from Bernard, which actually picks up from that. You know, why haven't the financial institutions made the changes already? Are the carrots / sticks too weak? Puninda, do you want to pick that up? I mean, what is there not enough incentive and not enough compulsion at the moment to get all these guys to act?
Yeah, I can kick off and welcome Alex and Emma to add to this. I think there is momentum, as we're seeing on the regulatory side, which is very helpful in making sure that there are some of those sticks, you know, in place, incentives in place to move the needle in the right direction when it comes to deforestation action, and we are starting to pick that up, starting this year. On the carrot side, I think, to Alex's point, there is no excuse at this point to note that, you know, nature is not elevated to the same extent as climate, and part of that also involves ensuring awareness among these financial institutions of the importance of this topic. Deforestation, unfortunately, is one of those issues that is critical, that we know at the heart of the nature and climate nexus, but never top of the agenda. So I think there is pressure from civil society, regulatory pressures, and a surround sound of a focus on deforestation, I think, is definitely needed to make sure this topic continues to be on the radar for financial institutions. We do hear that sometimes, you know, it's just something that slips from a priority list for financial institutions given other competing priorities. So we do need to make sure there is that level of accountability for financial institutions to continue pushing on the progress for this. And there is value in ensuring, in having, you know, all these different standards and frameworks like SBTI flag guidance that notes the 2025 deforestation timeline. We have the investor climate action plans that now incorporate deforestation. So as we hear the surround sound of guidance and frameworks pointing to the same you know, resources and timeframes, hopefully that will help drive some convergence on this. But yes, more is definitely needed to make sure this issue is urgently tackled.
Well, it's so interesting, and I think you know, just looking at some of the questions coming in. So Michael Fosdyke says you have to name and shame. So he obviously wants more stick. Miranda Bellchambers says, kind of, why not publish the names of the FIs that are making progress on deforestation to highlight them as best practice? I guess in a way, Emma, you do a bit of that. with the tracker, don't you?
Yes, definitely. So you'll be able to download our full dataset from our website and filter that dataset by total score. But also in the Deforestation Action Tracker report, we do detail, really strong examples where people or where financial institutions have strong policies or are starting to transparently report on that progress. We do pull out the names of those that are making progress, because we do want to champion them and show that that progress is possible.
Right, that's really clear. Look, we're into the last few minutes of this. Let's just do a very, very quick response. Puninda, just in a sentence, what would you love to see at COP28?
I think a very strong output on the path forward from the global stocktake and nature at the heart of that.
Oh, that was commendably brief and punchy. Thank you very much. Alex, what are you looking forward to, if at all, from this event?
I would obviously love to see a global agreement to phase out fossil fuels, but if I can't have that,
we need another hour for that. Yeah.
Then I would like to see deforestation front and center of the leaders' agreement on net zero agricultural systems, because we can't get there without preventing deforestation first.
Right, that's really good. And Alex, back to you. I mean, perhaps thinking beyond COP28 to the next deforestation tracker you'll be putting together for next year. I mean, what are you looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to hopefully more positive progress. I think the next 2 years have to be really significant. We have to see really significant, notable change and progress from financial institutions. We need to see deforestation conversion and associated human rights abuse policies that are publicly available, effective implementation and transparent reporting. And that 75% stats to come right down for those that don't have policies. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Well, look, it's been a great session. I think we've covered lots of ground. We've got to many of the questions, if not all of them. One of my favorite lines is time to ditch the excuses. I think that's a very powerful sentiment to take away. So look, thank you to our panel. Thank you to Global Canopy for organizing this. There's much more on their website. And the session has been recorded, so will be available for anyone to watch later if they need to. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.